Welcome to Male Revenge, my friend. Every story here is built on one truth. Justice waits. It watches, and sooner or later, it always finds its way home. Stay with me tonight. 6 weeks before my granddaughter's engagement party, I stood on the hillside where her mother had died 5 years earlier, listening to the young man who loved her explain in a voice far too calm for what he was saying exactly how far he still intended to go. You do not understand me, sir. I really do love her. That does not mean I intend to stop. The words came out of Julian low and steady, in the cadence a confession takes when the man giving it does not think it is a confession at all. We were standing in a place I have not told you about yet, a place with white flowers strung along a fence, and the smell of cut grass, and something colder underneath it, something like the air right before a storm breaks. My hand was wrapped around the bowl of my pipe so tightly the wood bit into my palm. And I remember thinking, with the strange clarity a man gets when his whole life narrows to one moment, that I had never once, in 40 years of asking men to confess their sins, heard one say it with a smile still resting on his face. I am getting ahead of myself. Forgive an old man his habits. A detective spends his whole career learning to start at the end and work backward, because the end is where the truth stops running. But if I am going to tell you what happened to my family, I owe you the beginning, when the porch light still felt safe, and the young man across my table was only a name I liked the sound of. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I am 72 years old. For 41 years I carried a badge for the city of Richmond, Virginia, and for the last 28 of those years, I ran the homicide division out of an office with a window that never quite closed all the way. I have stood over more bodies than I can count and asked more guilty men more quiet questions than any preacher ever asked a sinner. And I have learned this much for certain. A man does not confess because you shout at him. He confesses because you make him listen to himself. I keep a pipe I no longer smoke. My wife Eleanor made me promise to give it up the year our daughter was born, and I have kept that promise for 4 decades. I still carry it in my jacket pocket, though, and when something in a room does not sit right, my hand finds it without asking permission and turns it over between my fingers, like a man counting a rosary. Eleanor says it is the closest thing I have to praying. She might be right about that. That evening, the house smelled like the roast Eleanor had been tending since noon, and our granddaughter Lily was setting the table with the careless joy of a girl who believes all the way down to her bones that the world is basically kind. Lily came to live with us 5 years ago after her mother, our daughter Caroline, died on a hillside overlooking a valley belonging to an old friend of mine. I do not like to think about that hillside. I have spent 5 years training myself not to. Lily's young man arrived a few minutes past 6, carrying a bottle of wine and an easy smile that fit his face as naturally as a good suit worn 100 times before. Julian Reyes, a photographer, Lily told us, gentle and funny and endlessly patient with her. And I will admit that for the first half hour of that dinner, I saw exactly what she saw. Warm eyes, a laugh that came quick and did not sound rehearsed, a hand that found the small of her back without her seeming to notice it was there. We talked about nothing important. The roast, a photography show Julian had coming up in the fall. Eleanor asked him gentle and unhurried where he had grown up, and Julian answered without pausing, a small town 2 hours south of the city, a house with a red door, a mother who taught piano lessons on Saturday mornings. It was a good answer. It was, in fact, a perfect answer, delivered with the easy rhythm of a story a man has told 100 times, the ease of a story you love, or one you built yourself. I have spent my whole life listening to men answer questions, and there is a specific kind of smoothness that only comes from practice. Truth has small hesitations in it. Truth stumbles once in a while over an unimportant word, because the person telling it is remembering, not reciting. Julian's story had no stumbles at all. It moved like a river over stones worn smooth 1,000 times before. My hand had found the pipe in my pocket sometime during the story without me noticing. and I had been tapping it lightly against my palm. An old habit, a metronome for a mind still turning things over. When Julian finished his sentence about the red door, my hand went still. I looked at Lily, laughing at something Julian had said. Her whole face open, just as her mother's used to be. And I looked at Julian, watching her, with an expression I could not quite name. A look that resembled grief wearing the mask of tenderness. Some old, careful instinct in me, dormant through the 5 quiet years since I turned in my badge, opened one eye and did not go back to sleep. I did not say anything that night. I smiled and passed the potatoes, and asked Julian more questions about his photography, and I let him answer every one of them beautifully. But somewhere behind my ribs, in the part of me that had spent 41 years learning the difference between a man telling the truth and a man performing it, a small, cold certainty had already taken root. The young man across my table had just told me a perfect story. I have never once in my life trusted a perfect story. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay beside Eleanor listening to the house settle around us, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard Julian answer that question about the red door again, smooth as a stone worn down by 100 years of the same river. By 6 in the morning, I was in my study with a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow, and my old service laptop open in front of me. A detective does not stop being a detective just because the department takes back his badge. He only stops being paid for it. I typed the name Julian Reyes into every search a private citizen is allowed to make. And for a moment, I told myself I was being a lonely grandfather with too much time and too many old instincts left over from a career that no longer needed them. Then the results came back, and the old fool in me went quiet. There were photographs, a small gallery show 2 years back, his work praised as tender and observant. A social media account well kept, full of soft light and careful color. Pictures of Lily laughing on a porch, somewhere a coastline I did not recognize. A business registration current in good standing. A lease on an apartment across town, 4 years old. 4 years old. I sat back in my chair and looked at that number with the same scrutiny I once gave a body on a table, waiting for it to tell me something it had not meant to say. A man does not simply begin at 22. He has a childhood behind him, a school photograph somewhere, a scraped knee, a report card, a name on a church roll or a summer camp list. Somewhere in this country there should be a paper trail of a boy named Julian Reyes growing slowly into a man. The ordinary clutter every human life leaves behind without even trying. I could not find a single piece of it. I called an old friend from records, a woman named Patricia, who had spent 30 years filing things nobody else wanted to file, and who owed me a favor from a case neither of us liked to talk about anymore. I gave her the name, the approximate age, the state. She called back within the hour, her voice carrying the flatness of someone reading off a screen that refuses to give her what she wants. "Nothing before 4 years ago, Marcus," she said. "No school records under that name in this state or the 2 beside it. No birth record matching that name and approximate birth year. It is like the man was born walking." I thanked her and set the phone down very carefully, with the care you give something that might still be live. Eleanor found me there an hour later, the coffee gone cold and forgotten at my elbow. She did not say anything about the hour or the state of the coffee. She only stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, as she has stood in doorways for 40 years, watching me, as she watches a pot she suspects is about to boil over. "You have that look," she said. "What look?" "The look you used to get right before you told me you would be late again. Some evening 30 years ago." I closed the laptop, not fast enough to hide that I had closed it. "It is nothing, an old habit. I was curious about something and it did not come up as I expected. Curious about Julian." I did not answer right away, and in the small pause between her question and my silence, I watched something pass across her face. Not suspicion exactly, but the quiet patience of a woman who has spent 4 decades married to a man who investigates his own family out of instinct and calls it love. "He seems like a good young man," she said finally, gentle as she says most things. Do not go looking for reasons to doubt that, Marcus. Not everyone who walks into this house is a case. She was right to say it. She has been right about people for longer than I have, and more often than I care to admit. I told her she was probably right, and I meant it when I said it, and I did not believe it even a little. I want to be honest with you about what I felt after she left the room, because honesty is the only thing I have left worth offering. It was not fear, not yet. It was something closer to the feeling I used to get walking into a house where the furniture had been rearranged just enough to be wrong, where nothing was broken and nothing was missing, and yet every instinct I owned stood up at once and told me to look harder. A man can change his name. People do it for 100 honest reasons: to escape a bad father, to start over after a divorce, to leave behind a version of themselves they no longer wished to be. I have met plenty of good men who buried an old name as you bury an old wound, quietly, and kept walking. I told myself that. I turned the pipe over in my hand and told myself that twice. But an honest man who changes his name still leaves a seam. A place where the old life meets the new one, a school record that ends and a different one that begins. A family somewhere who remembers the boy before he decided to become someone else. Julian Reyes had no seam at all. He had simply appeared fully formed 4 years ago, smiling in a coastline photograph, standing in a small gallery, being praised for his tenderness, and then walking into my granddaughter's life not long after. I thought of Lily downstairs, probably already awake, already humming something to herself while she made coffee for a young man she believed she understood completely. A 26-year-old man cannot have only 4 years of life behind him, unless he is working very hard to bury the other 22. Eleanor caught me on my way out the door on Sunday morning, a mug of coffee in one hand and her old leather Bible tucked under her arm, carried to church for as long as I have known her. "You are digging again," she said. Not a question. I told her I was only going to see Desmond, as I have gone to see Desmond nearly every Sunday for 40 years, coffee at his kitchen table, before either of us goes anywhere else. She looked at me with the same knowing look she always gives when she already knows what I am not saying. Whatever you find, Marcus, or whatever you do not find, let it be the Lord's business in the end, not yours alone. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. That verse was not written for men who never feel the temptation. It was written for men exactly like you. I kissed her forehead and told her I was only having coffee with an old friend, and for once, that was almost entirely true. Desmond Kessler's farmhouse sits on 40 acres about 20 minutes outside the city, land his family has owned since before either of us was born. I have walked through that kitchen door since we were young men in uniform, since before either of us had gray in our hair, since before the year that changed everything between our families. And somehow, through nothing but stubbornness and love, did not manage to end our friendship. He met me on the porch, as he always does, wide across the shoulders, even at 74. A grip on my hand that still remembers what it was like to pull a man out of a burning car 40 years ago. Because he did exactly that once, and I have never forgotten it. "You look like a man carrying something," he said, before I had even sat down. That is the trouble with old friends who used to be good at reading people themselves. They see you the same way you see everyone else, and there is no pipe trick, no careful pause that gets past 40 years of practice. 40 years is a long time to know a man. Long enough to have stood beside him at 2 funerals and 1 wedding. Long enough to have sat in that same kitchen the week his only son was born. Both of us too young and too proud to admit how frightened we were of fatherhood. Our careers split early, Desmond into narcotics, and later into a security consulting business that made him comfortable in ways policing never made either of us. He liked to say we were the same coin, different faces. I never argued with him about that. There was a year, though neither of us speaks of easily. The year I sat across an interrogation table from his only son and watched a confession come piece by piece, slow, and then all at once. Desmond never once raised his voice at me over it. He only said once, quietly, at a kitchen table not unlike this one, that a man cannot hate the compass for pointing north. I have never forgotten how his voice sounded when he said it, steady on the surface, and something else entirely underneath. I told him about dinner, about Julian, about the perfect answer over the red door and the 4 years that did not add up to a life. I watched his face while I spoke, as I watch every face while it listens to something difficult. And for a long moment, Desmond only stirred his coffee and said nothing at all. "You always did see ghosts in empty rooms, Marcus," he said finally. And he smiled when he said it. The old, easy smile I have trusted since before Eleanor and I were married. Young people keep their lives quiet these days. It does not mean quiet is the same as hidden. "Maybe," I said. "A photographer, you said. Careful with the camera. Careful eyes." He said it lightly, almost fondly, in the tone a man uses about someone he has met and liked. "This town is smaller than people think, old friend. Everybody crosses paths with everybody, eventually." I had not told him Julian was careful with a camera. I had not told him anything about how Julian looked at a room before he stepped into it, the small habit of a man cataloging exits. I had only said, photographer, dinner, 4 years. 40 years of reading faces across interrogation tables told me exactly what I was looking at. Not a slip, a test. Desmond wanted to see whether I would notice, and whether noticing would frighten me into silence or draw me closer. I let it go. I told myself it was nothing, the kind of small overlap 2 old men in the same small city might share, without either one noticing a stranger, glimpsed once at a gallery opening or a coffee shop, filed away and forgotten by everyone, but a mind trained for 40 years never to forget a face. We finished our coffee and talked about easier things. His garden, my knees, the familiar ache neither of us mentions until the weather turns. He walked me to my car, as he always does, his hand heavy and warm on my shoulder, and told me, as he has told me 100 times before, that I worried too much for a man who was supposed to be retired. I drove home with the window cracked and the autumn air moving through the car, and somewhere behind my ribs, in the small, quiet room where I keep the things I am not yet ready to look at directly, I set aside one fact. As you set aside a stone you are not sure is worth turning over. Desmond had described a man he claimed he had never truly met. He had described him almost perfectly. I did not go home directly. I told Eleanor I needed air, and she let me have it, without argument, the quiet kindness of a woman who has spent 40 years married to a man who sometimes needs to sit alone with a ghost before he can come back to the table. I drove to the old field office instead, the one they retired the year I did, and sat in the parking lot with the engine off, thinking about the year everything with Desmond's family changed. 10 years ago, I did not know Harlan Kessler as a killer. I knew him as a patrol officer with an easy laugh and a badge that opened doors most men have to knock on. And I knew him as Desmond's boy, the one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder at department gatherings when he was young enough to still be soft in the face. The women started disappearing the year Harlan turned 30. Not all at once, never, in a pattern anyone noticed right away, because that is exactly how a careful man plans it. A waitress from a diner off the interstate, a nursing student walking home from a night class, a young mother last seen at a gas station 2 counties over. Each case filed separately, each ruled differently. One accident, one runaway, one unsolved disappearance with no evidence of foul play. Because the man closing each door behind him wore the same uniform as the men supposed to be looking for him. It took me 6 years to see the shape underneath those cases. 6 years of driving past old sites, on my own time, walking through empty lots and quiet stretches of highway, long after the official file had gone cold. Because something in each of those cases sat wrong, in a place I could not yet name. I have a gift, if you want to call it that, though there were years I called it a curse instead. I can stand in an empty room and feel where a body used to be, much as another man might feel a draft from a window that is not quite shut. I can look at a patch of disturbed gravel and see, almost like a film strip running behind my eyes, the order things happened in. Who stood where, who moved first, who did not move again. It is not magic, it is only attention, paid so completely and for so long that it stopped feeling like a skill and started feeling like a sense. The gravel at one specific scene told me the truth before anything else did. A tire pattern that did not belong to the victim's own car pressed into soft ground at an angle that meant someone had been waiting, not passing through. I matched that pattern eventually to a model issued to a very specific class of vehicle. I will not tell you it was a small step from there to a name. It took years longer, and it nearly cost me a marriage and a friendship I valued more than almost anything else in my life. Because the name the evidence kept pointing toward belonged to a man I had watched grow up at Desmond's kitchen table. I confronted him myself in a small gray room with a table between us. And I want you to understand something about confession, since it will matter later in this story. A guilty man does not break because you accuse him. He breaks because you ask him a question he has never once let himself answer honestly, not even in the privacy of his own mind. And you wait, patient as winter, until the silence becomes heavier than the truth. I asked Harlan Kessler what he thought about when he was alone in the dark. That was all. No accusation, no evidence laid out on the table between us. Only a question a father might ask a frightened child. He talked for hours after that. I have never told anyone, not even Eleanor, everything he said in that room, and I do not intend to start now. Some truths are not mine to hand out. I will only say that when he finished, he looked smaller than I had ever seen a grown man look. And he asked me in a voice that still sounded like the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder, whether his father would ever forgive him. I did not have an answer for him then. I'm not certain I have one now. I drove to Desmond's farmhouse myself that same night because I did not think a man should hear a thing like that over the telephone. And because 40 years of friendship demanded at least that much courage from me. He met me on the porch, the same porch I had stood on that morning, and something in my face must have told him before I said a word, because he sat down heavily on the top step before I could reach him. "How bad?" he said. Not a question either. Just 2 words, braced, I told him. All of it as gently as the truth allows, which is to say, not gently at all. He did not weep, not that night. He only nodded, slow and even, as a man nods when a doctor tells him something he had already half suspected. "You did your job," he said finally. "I would expect nothing less from you, Marcus. I would have been ashamed of you if you had looked away." I remember thinking driving home that night that I had never respected a man more in my life. I did not yet know that respect and forgiveness are not always the same coin, and that a man can say the noble thing on a porch in the dark and still years later be carrying something else entirely underneath it. Sitting in that parking lot years later, I found myself wondering something I had never once let myself wonder in all the years since. Not whether Harlan Kessler deserved forgiveness, whether Desmond had ever truly given it to him, or whether a man can spend 2 decades wearing forgiveness like a coat, while something colder grows underneath it. A man reaches a certain age and learns the difference between carrying a burden alone out of pride and carrying it alone because pride has become the only thing he has left to hold. I drove to Hal Doyle's garage the morning after I saw Desmond, and somewhere on that drive, I finally admitted to myself which one of those 2 things I had been doing. Hal spent 35 years working crime scenes before I ever thought to ask him for a favor that was not official business. And he spent his retirement exactly as you would expect, restoring an old truck in a garage that smelled of motor oil and coffee gone cold. He looked up when I came in, wiped his hands on a rag that had given up being clean years ago, and grinned at me. The grin of a man who has learned that laughing at his own knees is easier than complaining about them. "You have the look, Marcus," he said. "The one you used to get before you dragged me out to some field at midnight." "I need eyes I trust," I told him, "and access I no longer have." That was enough for Hal. He never once asked me if I was certain, which is exactly why I went to him first. He called Denise Foster before I finished my coffee. Denise trained under me for 4 years before I retired, back when she was young enough to still be nervous walking into my office, and confident enough to argue with me anyway, precisely the combination that makes a good detective. She met us at Hal's garage within the hour, still in her work clothes, a folder already under her arm. Because Denise Foster does not walk into a room without preparation. "You understand I cannot officially run facial recognition on a private citizen without cause," she said before she had even sat down. "I understand you are going to do it anyway," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, the same measuring look she used to give me across an interrogation table when she thought I was about to do something she would have to explain to a supervisor later. Then she opened her laptop. "For the record, this stays between us until we have something worth taking to someone who can act on it," she said. "I am not losing my badge over your granddaughter's boyfriend, Marcus, even for you." "Agreed," I said, and I meant it, though I would come to regret how long that agreement held. I gave her the photograph I had saved from Julian's public gallery page, the careful portrait of a young man who photographed light as other men photograph faces. Denise ran it through a database with access most private citizens never see, cross-referenced against records going back further than any public search I could have managed alone. Hal leaned against his workbench the whole time, arms crossed, quiet in a way that told me his mind was working even if his mouth was resting. "You know," he said finally to break the silence, "more than anything else, my eyes are not what they used to be. But even I can see you already know what that screen is about to tell you, Marcus." He was right. I did know somewhere underneath the part of me still hoping to be wrong. Denise's laptop made a small sound, the kind of sound a machine makes when it has found exactly what it was built to find. She turned the screen toward me, without a word, because Denise has never needed many words when the evidence could speak for itself. 2 photographs, side by side. One was Julian Reyes' gallery portrait, soft light, a small, careful smile. The other was a booking photograph from years before, a teenage boy sitting beside his father in a courtroom on the worst day of both their lives. A boy I remembered because I had watched him weep in the front row while I read the verdict that sent his father away forever. The match confidence sat at the top of the screen, a number I will not spell out here because numbers on a page have never once carried the weight of what they mean. It was enough. It was more than enough. "Julian Reyes," Denise said quietly, reading from the file beneath the photograph, "legally changed his name from Julian Kessler 4 years ago, shortly before he is believed to have relocated to this city." Hal stopped leaning against the workbench. "Kessler." He repeated the word, landing in that garage like something dropped from a height. "As in Desmond Kessler." I did not answer him right away. I was thinking about a kitchen table I had sat at only 2 mornings before, a warm hand on my shoulder, an old friend telling me that this town was smaller than people thought, and everybody crossed paths with everybody eventually. He had not been speaking in riddles. He had been telling me the exact truth and trusting that I would never once think to believe him. Denise closed her laptop slowly, the practiced care of a woman giving herself a moment to think before she spoke again. "This does not prove anything criminal," she said. "People change their names for all kinds of reasons. Marcus, you know that better than anyone. Grief, shame, a fresh start. None of it is illegal." "No," I agreed. But he did not tell my granddaughter. He built her an entire childhood out of nothing, a red door and a mother who taught piano. And he built it carefully enough that I nearly believed it myself. Hal rubbed the back of his neck, the closest he ever comes to looking troubled. A man does not spend 4 years building a lie that good unless the lie is doing something for him. Question is, what? Nobody answered that question in the garage that morning. We agreed to move slowly, to gather more before we moved at all, and Denise made me promise twice that I would not confront anyone on my own. I gave her my word. I did not entirely keep it, though not for the reasons any of us expected that morning. I was in my study going through old case boxes I had pulled from the attic when I heard the front door close hard enough to rattle the frame, followed by the specific quiet that falls over a house after two young women have said something to each other neither one meant to say out loud. I caught Maya in the driveway before she got her car door open, her hands shaking slightly around her keys in a way that told me this was not the first time she had rehearsed walking away angry. "Mrs. Whitfield is going to think I made a scene," she said before I said a word, which told me she already knew exactly who I was and how much I used to matter in this town. "You did not make a scene," I said. "You made a point. There is a difference even if Lily cannot hear it yet." She looked at me then, really looked, in a manner people rarely bother with a 72-year-old man unless they suspect he might actually be listening. "He watches her, Mr. Whitfield. Not like a man in love, like a man keeping track. Every time I try to explain it, it sounds foolish out loud, and she looks at me like I am the one who has lost something, instead of him." "What do you think he has lost?" I asked. Maya considered the question longer than I expected. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "But whatever it is, I do not think he means to find it gently." She got in her car after that, and I stood in the driveway a long moment before going inside, turning her words over just as I turned the pipe, looking for the seam where a young woman's jealousy might be hiding underneath what sounded uncomfortably like an accurate read on a dangerous man. I found Lily in the kitchen, arms crossed, cheeks flushed, the color they get when she is trying very hard not to cry, and losing the fight slowly. "Grandpa, please tell me you did not hear that," she said. "I heard a door," I said, which was mostly true and entirely useless as a lie. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I had first watched Julian answer a question about a red door with a smile that never once wavered. And she told me, in the quick, tumbling way she has always talked since she was small, that Maya had said something about Julian that Lily did not want repeated in this house. "She thinks something is wrong with him," Lily said. "She has thought it for weeks and never once said it to my face until today. And now she says it like she has proof, when really, she just does not like that I am happy. That is all it is, Grandpa. She has never liked seeing me happy, without her standing right next to it." I have interrogated men who lied more smoothly than that, and men who told the truth less convincingly. And I sat there wondering, not for the first time, whether the hardest interviews I would ever conduct were the ones where I loved the person across from me too much to press. "What kind of wrong?" I asked, as gently as the question allows. Lily's hand stopped moving on the table just for a moment, the small hesitation of someone who has already asked herself the same question and has not liked any of the answers she found. "She says he watches me sometimes, like he is checking on something, like he is making sure I am where I said I would be." She laughed a short, unconvincing sound. "That is not sinister, Grandpa. That is just a boyfriend who cares." I have spent a lifetime learning to tell the difference between a person defending someone they trust and a person defending a version of events they need to be true because the alternative is unbearable. Lily's voice had both in it at once, tangled together so tightly that I do not think she herself could have told you which one was speaking. I did not tell her what Denise's laptop had shown us. I had promised to wait, and there is wisdom in that patience, the kind a man learns after enough years of watching impatient men ruin cases that would have held if they had only waited one more day for the right evidence. But patience is a different animal when the case in question sleeps down the hall from you every night. "Talk to Maya again," I told her instead. "Not to argue, just to listen. "I will," Lily said in the voice of a woman with no intention of doing any such thing, and kissed the top of my head on her way out of the kitchen, just as she has since she was small enough to need a chair for it. I sat alone at that table for a long while after she left, turning the pipe over in my hand without lighting it, as I have turned it over 1,000 times before when a case would not let me sleep. Maya Chen had seen something. I did not yet know what, and I had no evidence beyond the instinct of one worried young woman who loved her friend enough to risk that friendship, telling her something she did not want to hear. But I have built a career trusting exactly that kind of evidence, the kind that never shows up cleanly on any screen Denise Foster could run a name through. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I began keeping a notebook. Not the kind of file I once kept for the department, nothing official, nothing anyone could ever ask me to hand over. Just dates, just small things. The nights Julian said he was working late, the places he claimed to have been, the gaps, if there were any, between what he told us and what a careful man could confirm. I told myself I was only being thorough. I did not yet let myself say the word I was actually thinking, which was watching. I heard Lily cry out before I saw her fall. A short, sharp sound from the back porch that had me moving before I had even fully registered what I was hearing. 41 years of instinct, still faster than conscious thought. By the time I reached the door, Julian already had her one arm braced under her shoulders, lowering her gently onto the bottom step as a man lowers something he has caught 100 times before. She was laughing, embarrassed more than hurt, cradling her right wrist against her chest. "I am fine," she said before anyone had asked. "I just missed a step. Ask Grandma how many times I have gone down these stairs since I was 12. Eleanor came out behind me, already reaching for ice, moving with the efficiency of a woman who has patched up scraped knees and broken hearts in roughly equal measure over the years. And for a few minutes, the porch filled with the ordinary noise of a family fussing over someone who insists she does not need fussing over. I watched Julian instead of Lily. He had caught her fast. Faster than I would have expected from a man standing where he had been standing several feet away, near the porch railing, his camera bag still over one shoulder. I have spent a career learning the difference between a reflex and a readiness. And what I saw in the half-second before Lily fell looked less like surprise and more like a man already braced for the thing he was about to catch. "Good reflexes," I said to him once Eleanor had herded Lily inside for ice and gauze, leaving the two of us alone on the porch in the fading light. Julian smiled, easy as ever, adjusting the camera bag on his shoulder. "I have always been quick on my feet, sir. Comes from chasing light. It never waits for you to catch up. Lucky you were standing close enough." "I like to stay close to her," he said. Nothing in his voice I could have pointed to as faults. No hitch, no hesitation. Only the smooth warmth of a young man who believed every word he was saying. Old habit, I suppose. I looked down at the step Lily had fallen from, still holding my flashlight, though I had not yet turned it on, and asked him in the same idle tone I might use to ask about the weather, whether he had noticed anything odd about the stairs before she went down. "No, sir," he said. "Should I have?" It was a fair question, asked in a fair voice. Nothing about it a jury would find remarkable. But I have spent a lifetime listening to men answer questions they already know the true answer to, and there is a specific stillness that settles over a careful liar in the half-second before he speaks. A stillness Julian wore for exactly that long, before his easy smile arrived to erase it. I thanked him and told him to get some rest. He kissed the top of Lily's head through the screen door on his way out and told her he would call in the morning. And I stood on that porch a long while after his car pulled away. I told myself it was nothing. A man who loves someone learns to move quickly around her. That is simply attention. I waited until the house had gone quiet that night, until Lily had been settled with her wrist wrapped in a mild sprain confirmed by the nurse practitioner who has looked after this family for years, before I took a flashlight out to the back porch alone. The step Lily had gone down on was the third from the top, An old wooden step Eleanor and I had been meaning to replace for longer than either of us would like to admit. I knelt beside it as I used to kneel beside far worse things, and I let my hands do what 40 years of training taught them before my mind had fully caught up. The step wobbled under my palm more than age alone should account for. I turned my flashlight along its edge and found the screw that anchored it to the stringer beneath backed out nearly half an inch. Just enough to leave the board unstable under weight without being loose enough to notice by sight in ordinary daylight. I have seen 1,000 screws loosened by decades of weather and use. They rust evenly, threads worn smooth by time, working against them, slowly and without malice. This screw was different. The threads near the head showed fresh metal bright, where a tool had recently turned it. A mark that does not come from years of humidity and frost. It comes from a hand, a screwdriver, and a decision made not very long ago at all. I sat back on my heels in the dark and looked at that small, bright scar of exposed metal for a long time. A man does not loosen one step on an old staircase by accident. He does it because he knows, or believes he knows, exactly who will walk those stairs and roughly when. And he trusts whatever follows will look enough like carelessness that no one kneels down at midnight with a flashlight to check. Somebody had known Lily would take those stairs. Somebody had known when. And somebody had stood close enough to catch her the moment she fell fast enough that it looked to everyone else on that porch like love. I thought about Julian's arm sliding under her shoulders before she had even finished falling. The readiness in it, the practiced ease. I thought about a man who photographs light for a living, who understands how a single, small adjustment can change everything a viewer believes they are seeing. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark with the pipe cold in my hand, running the sequence over and over, as I used to run a crime scene through my mind before writing a single word in a report. And every version I built ended in the same place. This had not been an accident. Somebody had built it to look like one. I called Hal and Denise before the sun was fully up, and neither one of them asked me why I sounded as I did. 40 years in this business teaches a person to recognize the distinct flatness in a voice that has just found something it did not want to find. We met at Hal's garage again, the closest thing any of us had to a room where the walls could be trusted. I laid it out for them as I once laid out evidence for a jury. Careful and unhurried, because a man who rushes the telling of a hard truth only makes it harder to believe. Somebody loosened that screw, Hal said, once I had finished turning it over in his fingers where I had brought it, still bright at the threads. Recently. You were not wrong about that, Marcus. I would testify to it myself if anybody asked me to. Denise had already gone quiet, as she does when her mind is working faster than her mouth can keep up with. Who has had access to your house in the last month? She asked. Not just visitors. Anyone with a reason to be alone on that porch, even for a few minutes. I went through the list with her, as I would have gone through a suspect pool years ago, and it was a short list because Eleanor and I do not keep a house full of strangers. Julian, of course, more times than I could easily count. A repairman for the water heater. Lily's friends coming and going as young people do. And Vanessa Cole, who had come by the week before to review paperwork on the trust Caroline had left for Lily. The kind of quiet family business that happens every year around the same season and draws no attention at all. I would not have thought of her twice if Denise had not gone very still at the name. Vanessa Cole, she repeated. Your family lawyer. For over 20 years, I said. She held Lily the week she was born. I do not say that to defend her. I say it because I need you to understand what it would mean if you are about to tell me something I do not want to hear. Denise did not answer right away. She opened her laptop instead, the same careful patience she had shown in this same garage only days before. And this time, what she pulled was not a facial match, but a record of calls. Months of them, spanning back further than I expected her search to reach. I should not have access to this, she said quietly, and I am telling you that once, so we are both clear on what I am about to show you. But there is a pattern here I could not ignore once I saw it. She turned the screen toward me. A long column of numbers and dates, calls between Vanessa Cole's office line and a number registered to Desmond Kessler, stretching back years, far longer than any ordinary professional relationship between a family lawyer and an old family friend would explain. Most of the calls were short. A few clustered around certain dates ran long enough to matter. One of them, the longest of all, had taken place the evening before Lily fell on that porch step. I sat with that for a long moment, the garage very quiet around me. Hal's old truck sitting half-finished in the corner, like something patient, waiting for a decision. None of us were ready to make. It does not prove she loosened the screw herself, Denise said, careful even now, unwilling to hand me a conclusion she had not fully earned. It proves she has been talking to him, regularly, for a long time, and that the timing of at least one of those calls is difficult to explain as coincidence. I thought of Vanessa the last time she had come to the house, how she had lingered a moment too long over Lily's photograph on the mantel, how she had asked, almost in passing, whether Lily still liked to sit out on the back porch in the evenings now that the weather had turned. I had thought nothing of the question at the time. It was the kind of thing an old family friend asks, gentle and unremarkable. I understood now that it had not been gentle at all. It had been reconnaissance, delivered with the practiced politeness of a woman who has spent 20 years perfecting the art of asking exactly what she needs to know, without ever once sounding like she is asking. Eleanor trusted Vanessa as she trusts very few people outside this family, the two of them meeting for lunch twice a year, long after any legal business had been settled, trading recipes and complaints about their knees, like women who had simply been friends for 2 decades and only incidentally also did business together. I thought about how I would eventually have to tell her, and I did not yet have the first idea how a man says a thing like that to his wife, without breaking something in her that had nothing to do with locks or screws or evidence. I called Vanessa that afternoon, not to accuse her, only to ask in the mildest voice I could manage whether she had enjoyed her visit last week. She answered warmly, effusively, thanking me twice for the coffee Eleanor had made her, apologizing once for staying longer than she had meant to, and, somewhere, underneath all that careful courtesy, I heard the same stillness I had heard in Julian's voice on the porch, the sound of a person choosing every word with more care than an innocent conversation ever requires. I thanked her and hung up, and I sat with the pipe cold in my hand, understanding now that whatever Desmond had built against my family, he had not built it alone. And he had not built it recently. He had been building it for years, one quiet, courteous conversation at a time. There are files a man keeps locked away, not because he has forgotten what is inside them, but because he has spent every day since making certain he does not have to look. I kept Caroline's file in a box in the attic beneath winter coats we no longer wore, and I had not opened it once in 5 years. I asked Hal to come with me when I finally did. He did not ask why I needed him there instead of Denise, and I did not explain it, though I think we both understood. Denise had never known my daughter. Hal had stood beside me at her funeral, had carried one corner of a casket, too light for how heavy it felt. And there are some rooms a man should not have to walk into alone. Even at 72, even after a lifetime of walking into far worse rooms by himself, we spread the file across my kitchen table, the same table where Julian had once told us a perfect story about a red door. And I made myself look at photographs I had spent 5 years training my eyes to skip past whenever memory offered them. The official finding had been suicide, a fall from the overlook on Desmond's land, the same hillside where 3 generations of Kesslers had watched sunsets, where Desmond himself had proposed to his late wife. Caroline had gone up there alone one evening, the report said, distraught over troubles in her marriage that were never fully specified. And she had not come back down. I had accepted that finding, as a grieving father accepts the thing that lets him keep breathing. I had not. I understood now, with a shame that settled into my chest like a stone, ever actually investigated it. I had been her father in that room, not her detective. And a father burying his daughter does not ask the same questions a stranger's death would have demanded of him. I remembered the last time I had spoken to Caroline, 3 days before she died. A phone call I had let run short because I was elbow deep in a case file that no longer seemed to matter at all. She had sounded strange that evening. Not sad exactly, but careful, in the tone a person takes when choosing their words around something they are not ready to say plainly. "Dad," she had said, "if I ever tell you something strange about someone up at the Kessler place, will you actually listen, or will you just start investigating everyone as you always do?" I had laughed gently, as a tired father laughs at a question he does not take seriously enough. I told her I always listened. I did not, in fact, always listen, and we both knew it. And I let the conversation drift toward the boys, toward Lily's school play, toward everything except whatever she had actually called to say. She never called back to finish that sentence. I had told myself for 5 years it was nothing, an offhand complaint about in-laws, the kind of small friction every family carries. I understood now, sitting at that table with Hal, that I had let my daughter's last attempt to warn me about something slip past unexamined, just as I had let an entire crime scene slip past unexamined, because grief and denial wear the same quiet face. Hal asked them for me now. "Where exactly did she go over?" he said, tracing a finger along the scene diagram, faded but still legible. I showed him. The northern edge where the ground slopes gently before the drop, nothing like the sheer cliff the word overlook conjures in a stranger's mind. A place a person could stand safely for hours, if they were careful, if they were not distracted. Hal was quiet for a long moment, the deep quiet of a man who has spent 35 years reading ground as other men read faces. "Marcus," he said finally, "the report says she was found roughly here." He tapped a point on the diagram. "But look at the impression measurements in the notes. Whoever documented this scene recorded 2 sets of disturbed earth near the edge, not one, close together, overlapping." I looked at the numbers I had refused to read 5 years ago, numbers a heartbroken father had signed off on without ever truly seeing them, and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the attic's draft. 2 people stood at that edge. I said the words coming out of me, as a confession comes out of a guilty man, slow at first, and then all at once. Not one. Hal did not answer right away. He only looked at me with the quiet gentleness of an old friend, who understands he is about to hand a man something no father should ever have to hold. "There is something else," he said. "The original responding officer noted a partial shoe impression, distinct from Caroline's. Never followed up. Case was closed as a suicide within the week. No next of kin objection on record. No reason for anyone to push harder." He paused. "Marcus, whose land was this?" I already knew the answer before he finished asking. I had known it for 5 years, as you know the shape of a wound, without ever once looking directly at it. "Desmond's," I said. The kitchen went very quiet. Somewhere upstairs I could hear Lily moving around her room, humming something soft and unaware. And I sat at that table, with my daughter's death spread out in front of me for the first time in 5 years, understanding that I had buried her twice. Once in the ground, and once again more quietly, beneath 5 years of a father's refusal to ask a single hard question about the place where she died. I would not make that mistake a second time. Whatever it cost me to finally look, I owed Caroline at least that much, even far too late to have helped her the first time it mattered. Eleanor keeps every photograph this family has ever taken, sorted by year, in shoeboxes stacked along the back wall of the attic, a habit she started before we were even married and never once abandoned. Hal and I found the box marked with the year Caroline died within 20 minutes of looking, and I sat on the attic floor with it in my lap for a long while before I could make myself open it. Desmond had hosted a gathering that same autumn, a harvest supper on his land, as he did most years. The kind of easy afternoon where two families who had weathered something terrible together tried for one evening to simply be families again. I remembered going. I did not remember until that photograph fell out of the stack into my hand that Caroline had gone too, 3 days before she died, smiling in the foreground with a paper plate balanced on her knee. Behind her, at the edge of the tree line where the lawn gave way to the path leading up toward the overlook, stood a young man I had never once thought to look at closely in 5 years of keeping this box sealed. "Hal," I said, and something in my voice brought him across the attic before I finished the sentence. He studied the photograph a long moment, then pulled a magnifying loupe from the case he still carries out of habit, the tool of a man who never quite let go of the job, even after the job let go of him. "Build is right," he said quietly. "Height is right. I would not swear to a face at this distance, not in a courtroom. But I would swear to enough to keep looking." We brought it to Denise that same evening. She ran what enhancement she could through channels she would not fully explain to me, and within an hour she had confirmed what Hal's loupe had already suggested. The young man in the photograph, standing at the edge of the tree line 3 days before my daughter died, was Julian Kessler, 21 years old, home from wherever he had been living, present on his grandfather's land the same autumn Caroline walked up that hillside and never came back down. "There is more," Denise said, and her voice had lost every trace of the careful professional distance she usually keeps around me. "The partial shoe impression from the original scene report. I compared the tread pattern against a boot style that was common among a very specific outdoor brand around that time. It is not a certainty, but it is not nothing. Marcus and I do not think you should hear the rest of this alone." I did not answer her right away. I only stared at the photograph still open on her screen, my daughter's face smiling in the foreground of a moment she believed was safe, unaware that death was already standing at the edge of the frame. Behind her, patient, waiting only for the right evening to arrive. Hal put a hand on my shoulder, the same steady weight he had offered me at 2 funerals now, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that either of us had not already understood. I drove home that night and sat in the driveway a long while before going inside, because I did not yet trust my own face to walk past Eleanor without telling her everything I was not ready for her to know. Lily's light was on upstairs. Julian's car was not in the driveway, and I remember being almost grateful for it, because I did not know yet whether I could look at him without my hands finding their way around his throat instead of my pipe. I heard the rest of it anyway, because there was no version of that room where anyone else could have carried it for me. I confronted Julian 2 days later, not with accusation, because I had learned a long time ago that accusation only teaches a guilty man to build a better wall. I asked him instead, over coffee on the porch where Lily had fallen only weeks before, whether he remembered ever visiting his grandfather's land as a younger man, back before he moved away and became someone new. He answered smoothly at first, as he answers everything, warm and unhurried. Then I mentioned the harvest supper. I mentioned the year. I watched something move behind his eyes, quick and involuntary. The sudden stillness of a man discovering that a door he believed permanently closed has just been quietly opened from the other side. "I do not remember that specific evening, sir," he said, and his voice was steady, but his hand wrapped around his coffee cup had gone white at the knuckles in a way I do not believe he was even aware of. I did not push further. I only nodded and thanked him and let him leave, believing he had answered well enough. He had not. A man who truly does not remember an evening does not grip a coffee cup as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. I sat alone on that porch a long time after he left, looking down at the same step Hal and I had examined by flashlight, and I understood with a certainty that settled into my chest like something final and unmovable, that my daughter had not thrown herself from that hillside in grief. She had gone up there and met someone. 3 days after a boy called Julian Kessler stood at that same tree line in a photograph I had kept sealed in a box for 5 years. And she had never come back down because that boy had made certain of it. I thought of Lily upstairs laughing at something on her phone, utterly unaware that the young man who kissed her goodnight every evening had once stood on the same hillside where her mother took her last breath. I did not yet know how I would tell her. I only knew, sitting there with the pipe cold and useless in my hand, that whatever happened next, I would not fail Caroline a second time. I almost told Eleanor everything. On a Tuesday morning, standing at the kitchen counter while she poured coffee, as she has poured it for 50 years, steady and unhurried, humming something low under her breath. I had the words arranged already, the careful sequence a man builds when he knows a sentence is about to change the shape of someone's life. I opened my mouth to say them. "You have that look again," she said before I managed a single word, setting my cup down in front of me with the quiet gentleness she saves for mornings when she already suspects the day will be heavy. "Whatever it is, Marcus, I trust you to carry it until you are ready to set it down properly. I am not asking you to hurry." I closed my mouth around the truth and swallowed it instead. And I have wondered many times since whether that was wisdom or cowardice. And I have never fully settled the question. I noticed the car 3 days later, a gray sedan parked half a block from the coffee shop where Lily meets Maya on Thursday afternoons, positioned at an angle that gave a clear view of the entrance without appearing to watch it directly. I noticed it again the following week, near the edge of her campus parking lot. The same careful distance, the same unremarkable color, that most people's eyes simply slide past. A man does not spend 41 years reading rooms without learning to read the streets around them, too. I followed it home myself one evening, an old habit dressed up as an evening drive. And I sat outside a modest house on the edge of town for the better part of an hour before I worked up the nerve to walk to that door. David Sinclair opened it before I finished knocking, and for a long moment, neither one of us said anything at all. 5 years of silence sitting between us, thicker than the door frame itself. "I wondered when you would finally follow the car, instead of just noticing it," he said. His voice had the same guarded flatness I remembered from the worst months of our shared grief. A man who had learned to keep his words short because longer ones tended to break in his mouth. "You have been watching her," I said. Not an accusation, just the truth laid flat between us as I lay every truth I am not yet certain what to do with. "Every week since she moved back in with you and Eleanor," he said, "I never once came close enough to speak to her. I did not think I had earned that." He stepped back from the door, an invitation more than a welcome, and I followed him inside a house that smelled faintly of sawdust and old coffee. A man living carefully and alone. We sat at his kitchen table, and I want to tell you honestly that I went there prepared to be angry with him. 5 years of unspoken blame still sitting somewhere in my chest from the season everyone, myself included in my worst hours, had quietly wondered whether the husband knew more about that hillside than he ever said. "I did not kill her, Marcus," he said before I had asked, because he has spent 5 years anticipating that exact sentence from everyone who ever looks at him too long. I have spent 5 years being the man who might have. It is a strange kind of prison, being suspected of the worst thing that ever happened to you. The police had questioned him 3 times in the weeks after Carolyn died, standard procedure for any husband whose wife falls from a height with no witnesses. And David had answered every question honestly, and watched the suspicion sit in the officer's eyes anyway. Because grief and guilt can look identical to a stranger studying a face across a table. Eleanor had never once voiced her doubt aloud, but he had felt it regardless. The cold chill of being handed casseroles by neighbors who were simultaneously wondering whether he belonged in a cell instead of a kitchen. He had left before anyone had to decide that question out loud, because leaving quietly seemed kinder to everyone, including himself, than staying to find out. I told him then what Hal and Denise and I had found. I watched something move across his face that I recognized instantly. The sudden stillness of a man discovering that the weight he has carried for 5 years belonged this entire time to someone else. "Julian," he said quietly, once I finished testing the name, "as you test ice before trusting your full weight to it. I have seen him with her. I did not know his history. I only knew I did not like how he angled himself between Lily and anyone else in a room, as though he were constantly making certain he was the only door she could see." "You noticed that too." "I have had nothing to do for 5 years except notice things," he said, and something almost like a smile moved across his face, brief and unpracticed, gone before it fully arrived. Turns out, losing everything makes a man very good at watching. We sat there a long while, two fathers who had each spent 5 years failing my daughter, in entirely different ways, one through absence and one through blindness. And for the first time since Caroline died, I did not feel entirely alone in carrying her. "I want to help," David said as I stood to leave. "Whatever this becomes, I am done watching from a distance." I told him I would call. I meant it, and driving home that night, I understood that I had just found the one man in this entire ordeal who wanted nothing from me at all except the chance to finally protect his daughter properly. The same chance I had spent 5 years quietly, uselessly, praying for myself. We had become a strange kind of team by then, the 5 of us gathering most evenings at Hal's garage, as soldiers gather at the only outpost still standing. David brought a patience to the work that surprised me, a man who had spent 5 years learning to watch quietly, now finally given something worth watching for. It was David who found the money. He had spent 2 days going through public filings, business registrations, anything a private citizen could legally pull on a man building a new life, and he laid it out for us on Hal's workbench, with the careful precision of someone determined to be useful after 5 wasted years of standing on the outside of his own family. "Julian's business registration," David said, "his apartment lease, the equipment for his photography, which does not come cheap, all of it financed directly or through a shell entity by transfers originating from Desmond Kessler's personal accounts. 4 years of it, structured carefully enough to look like ordinary family generosity if nobody ever added up the total." "How much?" I asked. David told me the figure, and I sat with it a long moment, because a grandfather helping a troubled grandson rebuild his life is not a crime, and every dollar of it could be explained away in a courtroom as nothing more than love wearing a generous face. It was not proof of murder. It was not even proof of malice. It was only a number. And numbers, I have learned across an entire career, mean whatever the story around them allows them to mean. "It is not enough," Denise said, echoing my own thought before I gave voice to it. A defense attorney tears this apart in an afternoon. Grandfather funds grandson. That is the whole story, unless we can connect the money to something he could not explain away. Hal let out a low whistle, leaning back against his workbench. "I have known Desmond Kessler 30 years myself socially. Man never once struck me as extravagant. That kind of quiet money, moving in the dark, that is not generosity, Marcus. That is a man building something and making certain nobody can see the scaffolding." "We need something that only makes sense if he is guilty," Denise said. "Something a defense attorney cannot explain away with a shrug and a checkbook." I told them I would go see him myself. Nobody argued with me, though I saw the look David and Denise exchanged. The quiet worry of people who had started to understand that the man I called my oldest friend might no longer deserve either word. I decided to see Desmond myself. One more Sunday, one more cup of coffee at that same kitchen table where I had first felt something small and wrong settle into my chest weeks before. I told myself I was simply gathering more the same patient work I have done my entire life. I did not yet let myself admit how much of me wanted desperately to be wrong about all of it. He greeted me, as he always does, warm and easy, his hand finding my shoulder before I had even reached the porch steps. We talked about nothing important for the better part of an hour, His garden, my knees, the familiar ache. Neither of us mentions until the weather turns, and for a little while I let myself believe, as I have let myself believe so many times before with this man, that I had simply become an old fool inventing shadows.
Then he asked about Willie.
"How is she healing?" he said, gentle and unhurried. Stirring sugar into coffee he has taken black for 40 years. A small, automatic gesture I noticed only because I notice everything now. That must have given you all quite a fright. A loose step of all things. The old ones always go without warning. I did not answer him right away. I had never told Desmond how Lily fell. I had told no one outside of Eleanor, Hal, David, and Denise the specific mechanism of that night the screw backed out just enough, the fresh metal at the threads. To the rest of the world, to anyone who had merely heard the news secondhand, Lily had simply had an accident on the back porch. A fall. Nothing more specific than that. Desmond had said, a loose step. I sat across that kitchen table from a man I had trusted for 40 years and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The same stillness I have felt only a handful of times in my life. Always in the half-second before a case cracked open completely. "I do not believe I mentioned that detail to you, Desmond," I said, keeping my voice as mild and unhurried as his own. For the briefest instant, something moved behind his eyes. Gone almost before I could name it. The same flicker I have watched cross 1,000 faces in 1,000 gray rooms, in the half-second before a guilty man decides which lie to reach for next. "You must have," he said, smiling, reaching for his coffee. "Or Eleanor mentioned it to my housekeeper. This town is smaller than people think, old friend. Everybody hears everything, eventually." It was the same phrase he had used weeks before about Julian, about a photographer with careful eyes he claimed to have never truly met. I had let it pass then, because 40 years of friendship had earned him the benefit of every doubt I owned. I did not let it pass now. I finished my coffee, thanked him for his hospitality, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel and my heart hammering harder than it had in years. Understanding at last that the man who had comforted me at every turn of this ordeal had not been comforting me at all. He had been checking, patiently, courteously, exactly how much I already knew. I told them everything on the drive back. The loose step, the flicker behind Desmond's eyes, the practiced recovery that followed it. And I watched David's jaw tighten, as a man's jaw tightens when he finally understands the true size of the thing he has agreed to fight. "A slip is not a confession," Denise said, ever careful, though even she could not fully keep the edge out of her voice by then. "We need something that connects him to more than one loose step, Marcus. We need the shape of the whole thing." It was Hal who found the thread, buried in boxes of old files I had not opened since the year Harlan Kessler went to prison. A witness statement taken during the original investigation from a woman named Grace Ellison, sister to one of Harlan's earliest victims. I remembered her only faintly, a name among dozens gathered during years of chasing shadows, a lead that had seemed thin at the time and had never been followed to its end because sharper leads had demanded my attention first. I found her still living 2 counties over, a woman in her late 50s, now gray at the temples, her hands steady around a teacup she never once drank from during the hour I sat in her living room. "I wondered if anyone would ever come back to ask me the rest of it," she said before I had finished explaining why I was there. "I gave a statement to a young detective many years ago, back when your team was still chasing shadows. Nobody ever followed up. I always assumed it got lost in all the other things a case like that generates." "Tell me now," I said. "All of it." She told me that 3 years before Harlan Kessler was ever arrested, before I had connected a single one of those disappearances into a pattern, she had gone to his father directly. She had suspected something about Harlan even then, a coldness in him she could not name, small inconsistencies in his story about the night her sister disappeared. And she had gone to Desmond Kessler because Desmond was respected, because she believed in her grief that a good father would want to know if his son had done something unforgivable. He listened to every word I said. Grace told me, her voice very steady, the practiced steadiness of a woman who has told this story to herself alone in the dark for many years, and has finally worn the sharpest edges off it. And then he told me I was a grieving woman looking for someone to blame, and that if I ever repeated my suspicions publicly, his family had lawyers who would make my life very difficult. I was young, Mr. Whitfield, with no money and no power, and I believed him. I sat very still in that living room, feeling something old and foundational shift beneath me, as a house shifts on ground that has quietly been eroding for years without ever showing a crack on the surface. He knew, I said, before I ever started looking. He knew, and he silenced you. He knew, Grace confirmed. I have no proof beyond my own memory of that conversation, and I understand memory alone rarely holds up in a courtroom. But I have never once forgotten his face while he said it, Mr. Whitfield. He was not surprised by what I told him. He was inconvenienced. I asked her why she had never come forward again, not to the department, not to a reporter, not to anyone, in all the years since. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. And I recognized the look, because I have worn it myself more times than I would like to admit. Because after a while, you start to wonder if you imagined the coldness in his eyes, she said. You start to wonder if grief invented a villain where there was only an old man managing his own private pain badly. I let myself doubt my own memory for a very long time. It was easier than carrying the alternative. I understood that same doubt better than she could have known. I had spent 5 years doubting my own instincts about a hillside on that same family's land, telling myself a father's grief had simply gone looking for shadows that were never truly there. I drove home from Grace Ellison's house that evening, carrying a truth heavier than any I had carried in this entire ordeal. Heavier even than Caroline's photograph in that attic box. For 40 years, I had believed that Desmond's hatred toward me was born the day I arrested his son, a grieving father's understandable rage against the man who took his boy away. I understood now that the truth ran deeper and colder than that. Desmond had known what Harlan was for years before I ever touched the case. He had protected him, silenced his accusers, allowed more women to walk into that man's path, while he quietly managed the consequences from a distance. His hatred of me was never truly about losing his son. It was about being exposed. I was the man who had finally dragged into daylight the thing he had spent years burying. And a man who has built his self-image around being honorable does not forgive the person who proves publicly and permanently that he was never honorable at all. 40 years of friendship, and I had never once sat across the table from the man I believed I knew. I had been sitting across from a performance so complete, so patiently maintained, that it had fooled the one person in this world trained his entire life to catch exactly that kind of lie. I sat in my car outside Grace Ellison's house a long time before I trusted myself to drive, the pipe cold and forgotten in my jacket pocket, understanding at last the true architecture of everything built against my family. It had not started with Julian. It had started decades ago, with a father who chose his son's freedom over a dead woman's justice, and who had spent every year since guarding that choice, as other men guard their most sacred possession. Lily came running into the kitchen 3 days after I sat in Grace Ellison's living room, her hand outstretched, a small ring catching the morning light, her whole face open just as her mother's used to be before the world ever gave either of them a reason not to trust it. "He asked me," she said, breathless, spinning once in place as she used to spin as a little girl showing off a new dress. "Last night, at the Overlook, on his grandfather's land, the same spot where he took his first real photograph," he said. "Grandpa," I said. "Yes." I held my granddaughter and told her I was happy for her, and I want you to understand that half of what I said was true. I was happy in the small, helpless way a man is happy, watching someone he loves believe for one more day that the world is kind. The other half of me stood somewhere behind my own eyes, cold and calculating, already understanding exactly what that location meant, and exactly what kind of evening was being arranged for her.
"We are having the engagement party at the farm," Lily said, still spinning slightly, still glowing.
Desmond insisted. He said family should celebrate on family land. Is that not the sweetest thing you have ever heard, Grandpa?
I told her it was lovely.
I do not believe I have ever told a more difficult lie in my life.
Eleanor came in from the garden, still holding her trowel, and when she saw the ring, she made a sound I had not heard her make since our own wedding day. Something between a laugh and a sob, both hands flying to her mouth. She pulled Lily into an embrace so tight I thought for a moment she might never let go. And over our granddaughter's shoulder, for just an instant, her eyes found mine. I do not know what she saw in my face in that moment.
I have wondered about it many times since. Whatever it was, she did not ask me about it in front of Lily, though. Later that night, once the house had gone quiet, she found me in the study and simply said, "Whatever this is you are still carrying, Marcus, I need you to trust me with it soon. I cannot watch you carry something alone through my granddaughter's engagement."
I told her soon. I meant it. I did not yet know how soon would actually need to be. We gathered that evening at Hal's garage, all four of us, and I laid it out plainly because there was no longer any use in softening what we were facing.
"They intend to finish this at the party," I said. "The same land, the same overlook where Caroline died. Whatever they have planned, they mean to make it look like celebration gone wrong. Grief and champagne, and a careless step too close to the edge."
David's hands had gone white around the edge of Hal's workbench.
"We stop it before it starts then. We tell her, tonight."
And she believes us over the man she loves and the grandfather she has known her whole life,
Denise said, not unkindly, but with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent her career watching good intentions fail against bad timing. "We have suspicion. We have a lawyer with a pattern of calls, a slip of the tongue, a witness statement never properly investigated, and a photograph that puts a young man near a hillside. None of it alone or together gets a warrant. None of it stops a party from happening exactly as planned. If we move now and we are wrong about the timeline, we lose the only advantage we have left, which is that they still believe we know less than we do."
She was right, and I hated that she was right. The specific hatred a man reserves for the truth that keeps him from doing the thing his heart is screaming at him to do. "Then we go to that party," I said. "All of us. We watch. We wait for the moment they believe themselves safe enough to show their hand, and we make certain Lily is never alone near that edge, not for one single moment, no matter what it costs any of us to guarantee it." We spent the rest of that night building the shape of it. Denise would arrange discreet support nearby, close enough to move fast, far enough to stay invisible to a man who had spent 40 years learning to read a room for exactly that kind of presence. David would stay close to Lily herself, near enough to intervene physically if the moment demanded it, a father finally given the chance to stand between his daughter and harm, after 5 years of only watching from a distance. Hal would handle whatever technical work the evening required. The same steady hands that had once processed 100 crime scenes now turned toward saving one before it happened. And I would do what I have always done best. I would get close enough to Julian to make him talk, using the only tool I have ever fully trusted: patience, and the specific kind of question a guilty man cannot answer safely, no matter which direction he turns it. "There is one more thing," I said once the plan had taken its shape. "I intend to wear a recording device to that party. If Julian says anything that confirms intent, anything at all, we will have something beyond suspicion for the first time in this entire ordeal." Nobody argued. David only nodded once, grim and steady, and Denise began working out, in her quiet procedural way, exactly how such a recording might eventually be used, if the evening went the direction we all feared it would. I drove home very late that night and stood in the doorway of Lily's room for a long while watching her sleep, as I used to watch her sleep as a small girl, safe and unaware, believing herself loved by everyone in that house. She was loved by everyone in that house. That had never once been the lie. The lie was that everyone in that house wished her well. Hal worked on the pipe for the better part of a morning, his hands steadier than I expected from a man his age. Fitting a recording device no larger than a shirt button into the bowl beneath a false layer of old tobacco, he packed in just enough to fool a casual glance. "It will not survive in actual lighting," he said, turning it over in his palm one final time before handing it back to me. "But you have not lit that thing in 40 years, Marcus. I do not expect tonight to be the exception." I took it from him and felt its familiar weight settle into my palm as it has settled 1,000 times before. Except now, it carried something more than habit inside it. For 40 years, that pipe had been a comfort I never used, a promise kept to a wife who asked very little of me across our marriage. Tonight, it would finally earn its place in my jacket pocket, for a different reason entirely. Denise met us at Hal's garage one final time before we drove out to the farm, laying out the shape of the evening as she lays out everything, careful and precise. I have 2 people positioned along the tree line, close enough to move within a minute of any signal, far enough that nobody at that party will notice them unless they are specifically looking. I cannot bring official presence any closer than that without probable cause. And probable cause is exactly what we are hoping this recording gives us tonight. "And if it does not," David said. "Then we improvise," Denise said. "And I answer for it afterward. But I am not letting that girl anywhere near an unattended edge tonight, warrant or no warrant." We drove out separately as we had planned, arriving at intervals so as not to announce ourselves as anything other than what we appeared to be, an old detective and his family attending a celebration on a friend's land. The farm looked exactly as it always had in autumn, string lights woven through the porch railings, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat drifting across a lawn crowded with guests who had no idea they were standing inside the final act of something that had been building for years. Desmond met me near the drive, warm as ever, his hand finding my shoulder as it always does. "Marcus, I am glad you came early. It means a great deal to Julian having your blessing tonight." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. And the lie came easier than I expected, 40 years of interrogation training finally serving a purpose I never once imagined it would need to. Julian found Lily near the drink table, and I watched them together as I have watched them together at every family dinner since the night he first sat at my table and told us a perfect story about a red door. He was gentler with her tonight than usual, if that was even possible, his hand never quite leaving the small of her back, his eyes finding hers again and again, as a man's eyes find something he is afraid of losing. I could not yet tell if that fear was performance or something closer to the truth. I have learned across a very long career that the two can wear an identical face right up until the moment one of them finally breaks. David positioned himself near the far side of the lawn, close enough to Lily to intervene, distant enough to look like nothing more than an old family friend nobody quite remembered inviting. Hal drifted near the food tables with a plate he never once touched. His eyes doing the work, his hands were pretending not to notice. I found Vanessa Cole near the porch steps, a glass of wine in her hand, her smile arriving a half-second too quickly when she saw me approaching. "Marcus, I did not expect to see you here so early." "Wouldn't miss my granddaughter's engagement," I said, watching her face as I have watched 1,000 faces across 1,000 tables. "You look well, Vanessa." "Thank you," she said. And there it was again, the practiced over-politeness of a woman keeping a much larger apology bottled somewhere behind her teeth. "It is a lovely evening for it." Eleanor stood near the dessert table with a group of women she had known for decades, laughing at something one of them said. Radiant in a way I had not seen her in years, and the sight of her happiness sitting so close beside a danger only she did not yet fully understand nearly broke something loose in my chest that I could not afford to let show on my face.
tonight.
She caught my eye across the lawn and smiled, and I smiled back. And I hated myself a little for how easily the two of us had learned, across 50 years of marriage, to perform contentment for each other's sake, even when the truth sat somewhere else entirely. I had promised her soon. I intended to keep that promise before the night was finished, one way or another, whether the truth arrived wrapped in relief or in something far harder to carry. The sun began its slow fall toward the tree line as the party filled in around us. Laughter and string lights and the easy warmth of a family celebrating something it believed was joyful. And underneath all of it, 4 of us moved through that crowd, carrying a truth heavy enough to end it. I felt the pipe in my pocket as I have felt it 1,000 times before. Except tonight. For the first time in 40 years, I understood exactly what I was carrying it for. Somewhere past the tree line, the same overlook where my daughter had died, waited in the gathering dark, patient, as it had waited 5 years before, for someone to walk toward it and never come back. I intended to make certain, whatever it cost me tonight, that history did not repeat itself on that hillside a second time. I asked Julian to walk with me toward the overlook, once the light had gone soft and gold. An old man wanting a quiet word with the young man about to marry his granddaughter. And he agreed, as he agrees to everything warm and unhurried, though his hand tightened briefly around his glass before he set it down. We walked the same path Caroline had walked 5 years before, and I let the silence stretch longer than comfort allows before I finally spoke. "Do you love her, Julian?" I asked. Not the version of loving her that looks correct from across a dinner table. The real thing. I have watched you for months now, and I have never once been fully certain I was watching a man in love instead of a man performing one very, very well. He did not answer right away, and the pause told me more than any answer could. "I do," he said finally, quietly, and something in his voice cracked open in a way I had not yet heard from him. "That is the part nobody accounted for, sir. I was supposed to feel nothing. It was supposed to be simple." "Simple," I repeated. "Tell me what simple looked like, Julian. Before her. Before any of this became complicated." He laughed, short and bitter, a sound with no humor left inside it. "Simple was watching you lose everything, as my father lost everything. Simple was becoming the last thing you would ever suspect. Patient enough. Kind enough. Until the day it no longer mattered whether you suspected anything at all." He looked out over the valley again, his jaw working. "My grandfather has been planning this since before I could grow a beard, sir. He built me for it, as another man builds a house. And then I met her, and she looked at me like I was already the person I was pretending to be. And I did not know how to want anything else." He stopped walking. We had reached the edge by then, the same soft slope of ground where 2 sets of footprints had once stood close together in the dark. And Julian looked out over the darkening valley with an expression I recognized instantly, the deep grief of a man standing at the exact center of a life he no longer wanted. "You already know," he said. "You would not have brought me here otherwise." "Tell me anyway," I said. Gentle, patient, the same voice I once used on his father in a small gray room. "Tell me what you were supposed to do to her tonight." "Grandpa!" Lily's voice came from behind us, bright and unaware, cutting through the gathering dark before Julian could answer. "There you two are. I was starting to think you had run off together." She laughed at her own joke, walking toward us with the easy trust of a woman who had never once had reason to doubt the ground beneath her feet. And I watched Julian's face change entirely, the conflict in it hardening into something close to panic. "Lily, go back to the house," he said, low and urgent. "What? Why?" "Because I asked you to," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. And that crack was the sound of everything Desmond had spent years building, finally beginning to break. "He is not going to do it," Desmond's voice said from the tree line, calm and even,
stepping into the last of the fading light. I raised you better than this, Julian. I gave you every reason, every proof, every year of your mother's shame and your father's ruin. And you are standing here, about to throw it away, because a girl smiled at you.
Lily froze, her eyes moving between us, understanding arriving on her face in slow, devastating pieces.
What is happening? Grandpa, what is he talking about?
Get behind me, Lily, I said. She did not move right away. For one terrible, proud moment, my granddaughter stood her ground, beside the man who had once caught her when she fell, looking at the man who had orchestrated all of it, with something that was not quite fear, yet more disbelief, curdling fast into fury. You were at my mother's funeral, she said to Desmond, her voice shaking but steady enough to carry. You held my hand. You told me she was watching over me from somewhere better. She is, Desmond said, almost gently. And that gentleness was the most horrifying thing I had heard him say all night. I simply helped her get there a little sooner than she planned. Desmond's hand came out of his jacket pocket, and the last of the light caught something metal and final in his grip, and every instinct I had built across 41 years snapped into a single, cold clarity that had no room left in it for an old friend's face. You do not have to do this, Desmond, I said, keeping my voice level, my body angled between the barrel and my granddaughter. It ends tonight either way. The only choice left is how many more people it takes with it. You took my son, Desmond said, and for the first time in 40 years, I heard the truth underneath his voice instead of the performance. You were going to take my grandson, too. I built this family back out of ash you left behind, and I am not watching you burn it down a second time. Grandfather, please, Julian said, stepping between Desmond and Lily, now his voice raw, hands raised, the boy I had watched perform devotion for months, finally choosing, in the one moment that mattered most, to mean it. Desmond's aim did not waver. Move, Julian, he said, his voice gone somewhere cold and final. I had never once heard from him in 40 years of friendship. Or I promise you, I will not miss twice. Lily's hand found my arm shaking, and I felt her breath catch behind me, and somewhere in the trees, I prayed Denise's people were already moving. Because I understood, standing on that hillside with my granddaughter's life balanced on the width of one old man's patience, that whatever happened in the next few seconds would decide everything. David came out of the tree line at a dead run, faster than I would have believed a man his age capable of moving, and hit Desmond low and sideways as a man tackles someone when the only thing that matters is the half second before a trigger finishes what a lifetime of grief started. The shot went wide into the dark. I felt Lily flinch behind me, her fingers digging into my arm hard enough to bruise. And then the night filled with motion. Flashlights cutting through the tree line. Denise's voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of a woman who had waited her entire career for exactly this moment to matter. Police hands where I can see them. David had Desmond pinned to the ground, the gun kicked well clear of his reach, and Julian stood frozen between all of it, and Lily, chest heaving, hands still raised from where he had tried to shield her only seconds before. Two of Denise's people moved past me toward Desmond, and within a breath, he was on his knees in the dirt. Hands secured the last of the fading light, catching an expression on his face I had never once seen in 40 years of friendship. Defeat. Lily collapsed into me, shaking, and I held my granddaughter as I had wanted to hold her every day since I first understood what was being built against her. And over her shoulder, I watched Julian sink slowly to the ground beside her. Hands trembling, now there was nothing left to hold steady for. Denise knelt beside Desmond, reading him rights he was no longer in a position to refuse. And I stood there, breathing, understanding that my granddaughter was alive, that the hillside had not claimed a second member of my family, that whatever came next would happen in courtrooms instead of in the dark at the edge of a cliff. But I was not finished. 41 years of instinct would not let me be finished yet. I knelt in front of Desmond, close enough that only he could hear me over the commotion still settling around us. And I looked at the man who had shared my table for 4 decades, who had held my hand at my daughter's funeral without once telling me the truth. He had carried since before I ever met him. "Tell them what you told me on that hillside," I said, quiet, patient, the same voice I have used on every guilty man I ever brought to his knees. "It will not change your sentence, Desmond. Tell them, because for one moment in your life, before it ends, I want you to choose the truth instead of the performance." He did not answer right away. I have learned across a career exactly how long that specific silence lasts before it breaks. And I waited it out, as I have waited out 1,000 silences before it. "I knew what Harlan was," Desmond said finally, his voice flat and hollow, stripped of every warm inflection I had trusted for 40 years. "Grace Ellison came to me, and I silenced her. I let more women walk into his path because I could not bear to be the father of a monster instead of a good man. When you finally caught him, when you took the one thing I had spent my life protecting, I decided you would understand, eventually, what it costs a man to lose everything he built." "Caroline," I said. "Julian followed her up that hillside on my instruction," Desmond said. And beside me, Julian made a sound, low in his throat, something between a sob and a confession of his own. She had started asking questions. I could not risk what she might find. Denise had gone very still, listening. And I understood that everything Desmond was saying now, freely, brokenly in front of sworn witnesses, was worth more than any recording hidden in the bowl of an old pipe. "The step on my back porch," I said. "Whose hand was that?" "Mine," Desmond said something, in his voice at last sounding ashamed instead of calculated. I would not risk sending Vanessa near a tool shed. I drove out myself the week she visited on other business, and let myself believe an old man's hands could still be careful enough. "And Lily," I said. Desmond looked past me toward my granddaughter, and for the briefest instant, something almost like grief moved across his ruined face. "She was never the true target, Marcus. You were. I only wanted you to understand at the end what it feels like to watch everything you love disappear because of one decision you cannot take back." I stood slowly, my knees protesting as they always do now, and I looked down at the man who had once pulled another man from a burning car, who had stood beside me at 2 funerals and 1 wedding, who had worn forgiveness like a coat while something far colder grew underneath it. "I understand exactly what that feels like, Desmond," I said. "I have understood it for 5 years. The difference between us is I chose to look for the truth instead of burying it a second time." Somewhere behind us near the house, raised voices told me Denise's people had found Vanessa Cole as well, her over-polite protests carrying faintly across the lawn toward a waiting car. I had no more anger left to spend on her tonight. I had spent all of it, and grief besides, on the man kneeling in the dirt in front of me. Eleanor reached us moments later, having run the whole way once the first shot cracked the evening open, and gathered Lily into her arms without asking a single question. The two of them holding each other, as women in this family have always held each other, when the men around them run out of things to protect them from. They led Desmond away into the dark, and I turned back toward my granddaughter, toward Julian, toward the whole shaken, surviving remainder of my family. And for the first time since opening that attic box weeks before, I let myself simply stand there, breathing, alive, and finally finished, carrying it, alone. I told Eleanor everything 3 days after the party, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where a young man once told us a perfect story about a red door. I told her about Caroline, about the 2 sets of footprints, about a hillside that had never held a suicide at all, only a daughter who asked one question too many, and a family who silenced her for it. Eleanor did not weep at first. She sat very still as I have watched her sit through every hard thing life has handed us. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I spent 5 years believing I drove her up there," she said. "I told myself if I had only been softer with her, kinder about David, less quick to judge her marriage, she would never have gone looking for comfort alone." "None of that was ever true," I said. "It was never your fault, Eleanor. Not for one single day of those 5 years." She reached across the table and took my hand, and I watched something in her finally loosen that had been clenched shut since the week we buried our daughter. I gave her back the truth that night, but I could not give her back those years. Nothing I have learned in 41 years of this work can return a person the time they spent grieving the wrong sin. David came to dinner the following Sunday, the first time he had sat at our table since the year Caroline died, and Eleanor set a place for him without needing to be asked. The grace of a woman who has spent her whole life making room at a table for people the world had wrongly pushed away from it. He was quiet through most of the meal, the same guarded quiet I remembered from our worst months together. But when Lily reached over and took his hand halfway through dessert, something in his shoulders finally came unlocked after 5 long years of carrying a suspicion that was never his to carry. Hal and Denise came by less often after that, as people do once the work that bound them together is finished. Though Hal still calls most Sundays to ask after my knees, and Denise sent a card that simply read in her careful procedural handwriting, "You did good work, old man." I keep it on my desk, beside the pipe. Julian turned himself in fully the following week, cooperating with every question the prosecutors asked him, testifying against his grandfather without softening a single detail. It will not erase what he did on that hillside 5 years ago, and Lily has not spoken to him since the night it all came apart. Though I have watched her stand at her window some evenings, looking toward a horizon only she can see, carrying a grief that has no clean name yet. Some wounds simply need time. Nobody can hand them faster than it comes. I found her there one such evening, and I sat beside her without speaking for a long while in the manner her grandmother taught me. Love sometimes looks like nothing more than staying in the room. "I love you, Lily," I said, finally, the words coming easier than I expected, after 72 years of believing love was something you proved through provision instead of speech. "I do not believe I have said that to you nearly often enough." She turned and looked at me, and for a moment she was 15 again, newly arrived in our home with nothing but a suitcase and a grief too large for her small shoulders to carry alone. "I love you too, Grandpa," she said. "I always knew, even when you did not say it." "I know," I said. "But knowing and hearing are not the same thing. I learned that lesson far too late in my own life to spare you the same weight." That same evening, I did something I had not done in 40 years. Hal had already returned the pipe to me that afternoon, the recording device gone. The little disc handed over to Denise, along with everything else that would matter to a prosecutor. I took the pipe out onto the back porch, the same porch where Lily had fallen, and a screw had told me the truth before anyone else would. And I filled it with tobacco for the first time since the year our daughter was born. Eleanor came out and sat beside me without a word, and when I struck the match, she did not stop me. Some promises, once they have finished the work they were given to do, deserve to be set down gently instead of carried forever out of habit alone. There is a verse my wife has quoted to me more times across our marriage than I could count, the one about vengeance belonging to the Lord and not to the hands of angry men. I understood it finally, standing on that hillside with a gun aimed at my granddaughter, choosing a confession over a bullet. God does not ask us to stop seeking justice. He only asks us to remember whose hands it ultimately belongs in. I have spent my whole life bringing guilty men into rooms and asking them to finally tell the truth. And I understand now that every one of those rooms was in its own quiet way an act of faith rather than an act of vengeance. God was in that work the entire time, whether I recognized his hand in it or not. And I believe he was on that hillside with us too.
holding a bullet just wide enough off its course.
If this story reached something in you tonight, if you have someone you have loved quietly instead of loudly for far too many years, do not wait for a hillside of your own to teach you the difference. Say it out loud, while the people you love can still hear you. Share this story with someone who needs that lesson tonight. And stay with me, because there are more truths in this town still waiting to be told. And I intend to keep looking 1 minute longer every single time.